Hello, it's Patricia Warby of Alchemy Therapies and all the other things I do. And today, second instalment of my discussion of Iain McGilchrist's What's Wrong? What's the matter with medicine? You know, why has it gone wrong? What's the fundamental problem? And last week I covered a little bit about left brain and right brain and how our culture is very left brain and how it's sort of identified things by studying them at great detail, but it's not really brought in a sense of wholeness. And today I want to develop that a little bit more, just sort of quoting a little from his wonderful talk, which I will include in the description, the original talk. It's very long, so obviously I'm trying to distill some of this into a shorter version and add my own take on some of the things we were talking about. So we got to the point of saying that our culture is very left hemisphere focused. It's really reductionist. It's looking at parts, not wholes. It's effectively producing a map of the world we live in that has very little information about the complexity and the relationships in it. It's just producing an interpretation. And so really his thesis was that left and right brain, or hemispheres more accurately, describes the world in very different ways. And what we pay attention to really changes the world we experience. And so if we're using our left hemisphere much more, we see the world as disconnected, as a soulless place. If we're using our right hemisphere more, we see the interconnectedness of everything. And really, one is healthful and the other is toxic. And you, I think, will know what I'm saying there. And so attention changes the world you experience. It's not just a one-way street. It's not just what you take in. It's therefore how you respond to the world and your perception of it. And I think understanding that we live in this amazing, complex, magical almost cosmos is something that will, I hope, allow us to escape the deadening reality that we're currently living in. And so attention has the nature of love, in fact, he says. So if you think about being in a position where someone is truly paying attention to you, all right, they're not just giving you lip service or liking one of your posts, but they're with you, they're present with you, and they are being with you. That is a loving act, right? And it's what most people crave, certainly in childhood and continuing in adulthood. We all want to be seen and felt by another. All right, and that's why community is so important. That's why relationships are so key to feeling part of something. And I think there is such a problem in medicine right now, and that we've devalued the nature of the relationship, the patient-doctor relationship. And in the past, of course, that wasn't the case. Doctors in the past didn't just give out potions. You would minister, he says, minister to the patient. All right. So think about that word. You know, you're giving support like a minister of the church would do. And they gave of themselves. Last week, I talked about how this sort of machine learning kind of way of doctoring is not only devaluing the doctor-patient relationship from the point of view of the patient, but it's also devaluing the skills of the doctors and giving them a sense of purposelessness. They're just technicians. And so that's what's kind of missing, I think, to some degree. But it also gives us a distorted view of the body, and that it's seen as a faulty mechanism. How many times have you gone into the doctor's office and they're typing away at the computer and they're not really looking at you or listening to you? They're just seeing you as another problem to be solved, all right? And your problem is what they're dealing with, not you, not the person experiencing the problem, but the problem presentation. And so it's a very machine way of looking at what can afflict people. Machines don't die, okay? They don't suffer, as far as we know. Even in the world of AI currently, there are no machines so far that die or suffer, right? But people do. They do, and they need other people to connect with them, to help them resolve that problem. And in fact, nothing in the entire universe, he says, is like a machine, except maybe a few lumps of metal that we have made in the last few hundred years. And what may surprise people is neither the inanimate world nor the animate world are well explained by thinking of them as machines. Okay, so even a rock, he says, grows, changes. It may accrete more material, it may dissolve. There are definitely ways in which it behaves in ways that are not completely fixed. All right. And so this is why he believes philosophy is intrinsic to science, in that it gives you a bigger perspective of what we are, the way in which we are describing the world, and therefore interacting with it. And he comes into complexity theory, that living things, even inanimate things like rocks, like crystals, like the sea, respond in ways that have characteristics of complex systems. And this comes from an area of mathematics called complexity theory. And it's being applied now also to biology. And we're seeing that complex systems are self-organizing. Okay, so they're not just complicated. It's not what we mean by complex systems. It's a self-organizing system. And that is such an important understanding, okay? Biology today, this is a quote from Carl Woese, I think that's how you pronounce it, Woese. Biology today is no more fully understood in principle than physics was a century or so ago. In both cases, the guiding vision has or had reached its end in both a new, deeper, more invigorating representation of reality, or was called for. A society that permits biology to become an engineering discipline that allows that science to slip into the role of changing the living world without trying to understand it is a danger to itself. Isn't that extraordinary? We are a danger to ourselves because we are describing something that we don't fully understand, and we're intervening in it in ways that we don't know the consequences. He ends with a very lovely metaphor. Molecular biology could read the notes in the score, but it couldn't hear the music. All right, it's about parts, not wholes. It's seeing the individual notes. Well, if I intervene in this bit here and change that, I can see how that might affect the next note, but I have no 360-degree vision. I have no broader concept. And so this is where medicine is, tinkering, changing something that doesn't fully understand in ways that are very limited. There is also the view that perhaps single cells and simple organisms are also responding to the world in which they live. And we can see that this neurological left-right division is present even in single cell organisms. A single cell organism can develop an intelligent response to a crisis. Okay, so that again differentiates living things from non-living machine type constructs. Okay, an intelligent response to a crisis that it cannot be prepared for either by evolution or by that cell's previous experience. All right, now this was the work of Barbara McClintock, and she won a Nobel Prize for this work. I always like to cite women because women are often ignored in science, or they're often misattributed to the men they worked with. So this is something that she studied. It's immediately brought forth somehow, not 2 billion years later, after random things have been tried, and eventually we find the answer. In other words, not by that sort of mechanistic view of evolutionary advancement, but if the crisis happens on a Thursday, on Friday, here's the answer, all right, or even an hour or two later. There is something self-organizing about living systems that enables them to solve problems almost instantaneously. There is an intelligence in the system that you cannot replicate in a machine. The machine is only as good as its programming, all right, and that rarely is able to do those sorts of feats. Interestingly, a living structure is always a long way from stasis or a dynamic equilibrium. We often used to talk about homeostasis, as if something maintained a fixed state, but it's been renamed allostasis because it's in fact in dynamic equilibrium. between states. Everything living is always in motion, even emotions, by the way. Emotions are a flow, they are an energy that passes through you, that you perceive. They're not just mental, they're mind-body constructs, you feel them. But if you understand that machines don't have emotions yet, as far as we understand, then that is another delineation, isn't it? And we might think of that as a human experience, but look, the cell in itself is never static. We just thought it was because we saw diagrams and we froze things and we drew diagrams from frozen non-living things to create our view of what cellular structures did. But if you follow something that's actually living and look at it in a living state, metabolism and things changing is dynamic, and you can't stay the same because metabolism itself is change. And Heraclitus, who was actually Iain's favorite, most esteemed philosopher prior to Socrates, said, by changing, it remains itself. All right. So in the nature of a living thing is the change enables it to stay functionally and metabolically active. It keeps itself going. And that is extraordinary. There is nothing about a cell that is linear. It doesn't follow a straight line. All right. Understanding the complexity seems to come both top down as well as bottom up. Now, I found that when I'm making shifts with people, when we're working emotionally through the body, it's not just one input I make, it's several. And when that all clicks into place, people make extraordinary leaps in understanding of themselves, and they change their responses to life, and they become almost new people. It's hard to explain, but it's an interdependent mutual constitution. Okay, so it's a dynamic equilibrium of multiple inputs and outputs. It's not about parts and identifying the thing to fix. All right, that's misunderstanding, that's left brain thinking. These parts are constantly rebuilding themselves, all right, remodeling themselves. We see that in an embryo when it develops into any living organism. It grows by differentiating its cells from each other, all right, not by adding in bits, but by splitting apart almost and becoming more differentiated. And so, unlike machines, living things have imprecise boundaries. And not only that, and this blew my mind, they engage in bootstrapping. What do we mean by that? We mean, well, let's say the opposite. So no machine can generate a code by which it can be constructed at the same time that it in itself is coming into being. That's bootstrapping, right? But cells can do that. They can change themselves from within at the same time as they are in the act of becoming and growing. That isn't the new biology that we're discovering, okay? We could give an example in the genome, with DNA, which there was a lot of focus on in the early 2000s. So we were going to map the genome. Once we had all the genes in sequence, we were going to create the end to world disease. But what we found was that 98% of the DNA in the human genome is what they termed at the time junk DNA, which means non-coding, because we already came into it believing that every gene had a code and that would be read out. And then once we cracked the code, we would be able to eliminate disease. And of course, that's not the case. 98% is just sequences that repeat themselves that have no known output. And we called it junk because our left brain thinking tells us it has no function. All right, well, Iain says, I suspect that we'll find later that it's not junk in any sense, and he's absolutely right. I need to add in there that it's a genetic resource for cells and kind of a nursery where new genes can evolve. Okay, so it's not junk at all. But that little 2% that's left that does code for specific genes can't possibly account for all the complexity of constructing an organism. So where is it coming from? Okay, well, you could say it's this interaction with the energy and information that's in the universe itself, in the field of interaction. And there I'm getting into a bit of quantum physics, but we now know that we exist in a field of constant flux of energy and information. And really, as living beings, we are both in communion with that, and we are changing it as we are living. Okay. Now, the final point I think he was making here is that the humanities, in his view, philosophy and literature, are the essential context for science, especially clinical sciences, because it gives you this wider view of life. And so massively interconnected is it that you can't possibly understand how it works. But if you're only focusing on one tiny little part of the picture, then you are really not seeing the whole. Okay, and so all our interventions in medicine are trying to take things apart and acting on those parts. And so it's really, really reductionist, and that's why it doesn't work. We also forget the interiority, he says, of the human subject cannot be excluded from the picture, right? The internal meaning you make of life and yourself, all right? And it's science doesn't really want to take that into account. Medicine certainly doesn't. And it forbids it almost. It says it's based on the idea that we're just not going to look at your purpose or your values in life because that's outside of our remit, and it's messy and it's complicated. But if you understand that we are not static machines, we are processes that flow with life, then here's a great metaphor for you. Each living being is like a whirlpool in the stream. Okay, there's this greater field of energy and information, and we're like a little whirlpool. Each one of us is a whirlpool in the stream. Now, was the whirlpool in the water? Are we in this stream, or are we composed of, are we part of the water? Well, I would conclude along with Iain that we are part of it. We are whirlpools that are for a time in the stream, and we have our day, as it were, and as a whirlpool, and then we go back into the larger flow again when we die. Okay, and so that's such a different vision of living and dying than the one we're inculcated with, that life is a struggle and you have to maximize your time and accumulate as many goods and achievements as you can in the limited time that you have. And then we're just so frightened of the end and what it's going to be, this nothingness that we perceive it to be, that we will pursue our goals to the detriment of ourselves and everyone else and our world. If we saw it as a continuum, right, that there's no beginning and end, it's just flow, I think we'd have a lot less fear of death. Okay, and you saw yourself as part of something, and actually your life was a gift, you know, and the quality is important, what you perceive in the world, how much you give back to the world, taking time and responsibility to make it the best you can, not in a kind of pushy, driven, accumulative sort of way, but taking time out to really appreciate the world that we're in. But that's not how the modern world works. The quantity is so much more important than quality in everything we see, and particularly in medicine. And it's a really, really terrible guide to what is valuable. Okay, look at money. You can accumulate more money than you'll ever use in your lifetime. We have a global elite who have that kind of existence. It's completely nonsensical. It values quantity over quality. But it doesn't give us value or meaning. What life does more than anything is it responds to value. And the work of John D. Martini comes to mind here, and he talks a lot about values being translated into the body. And what we mean by values is what gives you meaning, what's your highest value in life. You know, for me it's education, okay, but for some people it's friendship or family, or for some it's money, clearly. It responds, your body and your mind respond to how you live your life, not just the length of your life. All right. And Iain says it's about resonance, responsiveness, the business of relation. Okay, so everything is in relationship to everything else. And so everything that exists is primarily relational. Okay, so being human is about attention and intention. It's about making your focus things that nurture you. And in all ways, that is so different to the way we're treated in medicine and the way we're treated generally as we're means to an end for global corporations. You know, we're commodified. Everything we think or do is now commodified in some way or another. We're not allowed to be truly human. And I think that's why we're seeing a huge rise in anxiety and overwhelm, particularly in kids, which is just awful. So a computer then, if you think of that as the ultimate machine, can solve a defined problem, but most human beings are not that easily defined because relationships exist at multiple levels. Okay, the doctor-patient relationship is one relationship, relationships between individuals, relationship between individuals and their society, which Dr. Gabor Mate talks a lot about in his new book, The Myth of Normal. I'm 3/4 of the way through that now. What a book. It's incredible. And it's supported by so many other videos I'm watching about, you know, global corporations have taken over. I mean, it's not conspiracy theory, it's conspiracy truth in some ways. But they're doing it in a very different way now because data is valuable, and so they'll mine you as a source of data, and they'll sell you whatever makes more profit. So we're being treated like machines, and people who are treated like machines end up depressed and miserable. It makes us sick. Let's go and end with the three things that make people feel fulfilled then and happy. All right. Number one, a sense of belonging to a coherent society that shares beliefs and practices that they can trust. Is that happening now? It may do in your church, in your local community, but in terms of the bigger societal issues we're facing, I think not so much. Something that you can share your life with, all right? It's relational. The second is closeness to nature. That's hard to say. And we're not talking about going for a walk with your headphones on or improving your physique, going jogging or whatever. It's looking and being in the world, exploring, understanding, feeling it. Not looking at your phone while you're doing something else, and that's not being in nature, all right? It just isn't. So just being aware of the wondrousness of what it is you're looking at. You know, I can go out and I can look at the way the trees are greening up. It's spring here, and the way the different trees, the shapes and formations of the leaves and how they're held. I have a definite wonder about that. And the third thing is having some connection to the spiritual. All right, it's not very popular. A lot of people want to downplay the spiritual as being religious, and it's not necessarily the same thing. For many people it is, but it's not necessarily so. But the evidence is very clear, as Iain says, you know, people who have a connection in a spiritual way to something bigger than themselves, that they share that in a community of people, live longer and have better health. And those effects are bigger than not smoking, exercising, or diet. All right, they just change the informational content of the mind body to one that feels connected, all right, which is the truth of who we are. So folks, you have a choice to be commodified and commercialized by this capitalist data mining society that we're in. There's a wonderful talk by a Greek economist who I'm going to also include in the description here, who says we're in a kind of form of serfdom now. You know, even when we buy books on Amazon or we post on all the social media channels, they are data mining us, and then they're selling us products that fit our particular dis-ease, you know, what we are experiencing. They can commodify that uncertainty and that ill at ease feeling, and they can sell you products that you don't need but make you feel temporarily better. So that's where we are. So that's where I wanted to end for today. And, I've covered a lot of ground. I mean, Iain's original talk is, I think, about an hour and a half. I'm trying to get these into bite-sized 20 minutes at most, usually about 15 minutes. I hope you've enjoyed today. If you've got any questions or you want to make comments, please do. I always read them. And if you want to come and work with me in any sense, then contact me on alchemytherapies.co.uk. And you'll also find me on patriciawarby.com, but that's more my books and courses and the education side. So I'll look forward to hearing from you. Take care, everyone. Speak soon. Bye for now.